Good Saturday morning from here in the land of enchantment. As you recall, my name is T.J. Riley, and I'm happy to present this lesson on Chapter 5 from our textbook, Ethics Around the World. You'll recall that we just finished Chapter 3, where we looked at what we're kind of referring to as the Western perspectives. And we had three ethical views there. You'll recall we started with the utilitarians, both act and rule utilitarianism. Then we switched over to Kant's approach and his notion of respect for others and the categorical imperative. And then we finished up that chapter with a look at, pardon me just a moment, it's allergy season here in Albuquerque, it being, March 8th, it's a Saturday. So we finished up Chapter 3 then with a nice review of Aristotle and virtuous living. All of these things we're trying to add then into our ethical toolbox so that we can gather sort of the principles and course theory that can help guide us then when we're confronted with ethical situations, whether they be in the workplace as professionals or even in our personal lives. So now we're going to shift here in Chapter 5 to what we're going to refer to sort of as Eastern views and perspectives, and we're going to jump right in here with Confucianism. We're going to do a little bit of Zen, kind of a general viewpoint, and then we'll finish up with a little bit on Hinduism and some comments then on how what steps we might take when we find ourselves in sort of cultural conflicts. So let's get started with Confucianism. You'll recall that in our Western views, we pretty much focused on what we would call secular views. Here in the East, and even in Western views, we often find, as Dr. Rice mentioned, and I think it'd be the third lesson, topic 3, where we find that ethics and religion in some cultures are so intertwined that you can't just secularize them or separate them like we did with Kant's categorical imperative, or Aristotle's idea of the golden mean and seeking to live virtuously in the world. Excuse me again. I'll just say maybe one big excuse me, and then we'll know that it's allergies that are giving me a rather interesting voice this morning. So we'll recall, and we'll take from Dr. Rice's third lesson there, that that sometimes the religion and the cultural ethical values are very intertwined, and so we won't get caught up in that, but we'll notice that sometimes that occurs, and we'll start out here with Confucianism. Because we're seeking the question, what does a person of integrity look like, if you will? What is the character of that person? Confucius has some points to add to our ethical toolbox. So he calls them the basic characteristics of a morally superior person. I think we'll give that a little less highfalutin and morally superior sound by saying these are the characteristics that we can think about of a person with integrity. Number 1, says Confucius, we have moral equals as our friends, and that is then beneficial to one's own virtue, obviously so. And you'll notice that as we move between the Western and Eastern moral and ethical perspectives, we're going to see quite a few commonalities. We're going to see quite a few connections between them. So please be on the lookout, always be on the lookout, for connections and commonalities. Differences are often much easier to see, but they're not as useful as what we have in common, where we have common ground and can meet. And we'll see that later in this lecture when we talk about cultural conflict and how we can resolve them by at least looking for our common ground, looking for those things that we share and can then negotiate with. So Confucius starts us out here with this idea that we have moral equals as friends, and that's beneficial to your own virtue. I always think of when you're playing tennis in particular, you want at least a partner or an opponent that is equal to you or better, because it raises your game, if you will. So Confucius says if you have moral equals as friends, they're not going to pull down your game, if you will, but they're going to enhance your virtue and encourage you to be even more virtuous and live virtuously also. Here, obviously, so we see Kant's respect for others. We respect all people as intrinsically valuable, and that they and encourage them then, as well as ourselves, to live virtuously in the world. So that's one mark of a person of integrity, and it connects to both Aristotle's virtuous living in an obvious way and Kant's respect for others as well. Number 2, says Confucius, a person of integrity is focused on duty, learning, and careful speech. Well, that's a pretty heady list. Duty, we get obviously a connection to our own no rule, in that we have obligations as professionals because we have opportunity, those beyond ordinary skills, expertise, and knowledge. And so people then have real needs in the world, and therefore we have obligations or duties. So a person of integrity, under the oh no rule, would certainly have obligations to clients and society in general. Obviously, a person who's growing in integrity is also going to be focused on their learning, as you all are here in class. And our hope is to build that ethical toolbox for you to then carry your learning out into the world and apply it in your professional lives, and also these all apply in your personal lives. And careful speech, if you'll notice in our textbook, a number of the chapters are focused on communication, and I would refer you to, I think, at least chapters 2 and chapter 7 as being particularly helpful in developing this part of this characteristic of a person with integrity, which is careful speech. Moving on, Confucius mentions point 3, a person of integrity acts before he or she speaks, and then speaks according to his or her action. And this at first seems just kind of an odd way to put it. First, acts before he speaks, and speaks according to his action then, or her action. And one way I could wrap my brain around this is to say, well, basically your words and your actions ought to be consistent. They ought to match. You shouldn't give what some people call lip service. Or you shouldn't, if you're saying, oh, I believe X, and then you do something, you do totally different thing, Z, then your words and your actions aren't matching up. And there's a nice quote that we'll talk about at the end, but also that we can mention here by an American philosopher named Charles Sanders Peirce. And he said, what are called a person's principles are only certain beliefs that he or she may or may not carry out. They therefore, their principles, what they say, do not compose their character, but the general expression of the facts or the actions the person takes, that shows their real character. So we'll talk about that more a little bit at the end, I think, when we talk about cultural conflict. But that's really what Confucius is talking about here. Your words and your actions, need to be consistent with one another. Just a second. Number 4, a person of integrity follows moral principles while still valuing humanity. Here an obvious connection is to Kant and respect for others. You have this general sense of respect for the intrinsic value of all other people. And as you'll notice in your reading, this connects directly with Confucius's idea also in the 3 central virtues of Zen. There's that particular, you practice virtues so that you're in a position to to have healthy, positive relationships with others, and with really a broad basis and foundation in respect. Number 5, Confucius says a person of integrity seeks to improve him or herself. And here we've seen that already, certainly with Aristotle in Virtuous Living. His golden mean is about being a balanced human being, and it's just going to lead to improving yourself, improving your whole personhood that we've talked about in the past, not just your intellect, but having a good emotional balance and having a harmonious spirit with which to act and do the right things in life. And number 6 is then related to number 5, I think. It says, in seeking, oops, I can't get my glasses on that one, in seeking to establish your own character, you'll also wish the same for others. Obviously a connection to Kant's respect for others, right? The categorical imperative, you remember, is both universal and reversible. So what you're expecting of others, you also practice yourself, and that's what's going on here. You want to improve yourself, and you want to help others do that as well in any way you can, and that's certainly something a professional and a person of integrity seeks when they're operating under that Ono rule. And 7 then wraps up the characteristics of a person of integrity from Confucius's view by saying becoming successful also includes helping others. So you see, become successful. So you see 5, 6, and 7 all connecting together in that similar principle of a combination of Aristotle's virtuous living and Kant's respect for others and that categorical imperative. And note here too that Confucius isn't really talking about success as being monetary or material in nature. He's talking about success of a person, building a successful personhood, a person of integrity, not just monetary gain or material goods. And so his success idea is founded in those virtues then of a morally superior or person with integrity. Those 7 virtues mentioned there in your text, that broad-mindedness, benevolence, wisdom, humanity, courage, dignity, rightness, which is sort of that right action idea again, I think, where your speech and your actions match. And then a series of things called firmness, strength, simplicity, and again, that caution in speaking. There's a nice saying that goes like this. It says, know more than you say. And I think that's what Confucius is getting at too. Caution in speaking means really, think before you speak. So that wraps up both the characteristics of a person of integrity from Confucius's view and sort of his list of virtues, which you'll notice cross over with some of Aristotle's, and also relate to some of our obligations to clients. To wrap up our talk here on Confucius, we'll just go over quickly later in the chapter about well, okay, that's great. Now we know what the characteristics are and what our obligations are as professionals operating under the Ono rule. Well, how do you stay on track? I mean, those are not simple things to do on a daily basis, but all our course theory, everything we're putting in our ethical toolbox is hopefully something we're going to be able to apply then in real life, so that when we're confronted with an ethical situation, an ethical dilemma, we say, let me look in my ethical toolbox, right, and see what I learned from the course that I can apply to help me resolve this particular ethical issue in the most successful, well-balanced way possible. So how do you stay on the right track? Well, we're going to see some connections here between Aristotle and our other philosophers from the West, if you will, and Confucius from the East. One, Confucius says what? Moderation. And that's the same, you'll recall, as Aristotle's golden mean. You want that moderate approach. You don't want to be foolhardy. You don't want to be overly cautious. You want to be courageous. And you can flip back in the textbook to page 61, where Aristotle lays that out. And this is what Confucius is saying too. You want to stay on the right track and be a person with integrity, living virtuously. Well, you'll need to practice moderation. He also says fairness is a right way to stay on track. And I don't think that's in your textbook. I think the little exchange between Kuhn and Confucius here on your outline, basically Kuhn says to Confucius, okay, look, you've given us these ideas of what a person, morally superior person, their character traits. You've given us a whole list of the virtues that person would display. So, but can you put it down to a single concept that we can take as a guide for the actions of our whole life? And I think that's a huge question. It's pretty handy to have one, and that's really what Kant was kind of doing in his categorical imperative, and what Aristotle was saying in moderation, practice the golden mean. And Confucius said something similar then. He said, well, okay, one concept that I could take then as to guide all my actions in life. And he says, sure, what about fairness? What you don't like done to yourself, don't do to others. And that's from the Analects, 1523. You can all check that out online or in other media sources. And so that's what he's saying. He's saying, okay, look, how about fairness? You'll recall that's one of our obligations to clients. It's also an obligation we have to general society, to be fair. And you'll see that same thing. I mean, I believe Jesus says something like that also, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Well, this is sort of the flip side of that with the same sort of meaning. And so that's the first two parts of how to stay on the right track. The third one Confucius is going to offer, he says, well, you also want to think about, here's another list, get ready, the 9 wishes or patterns of awareness. And I think if there's one thing I would encourage all people to learn that is helpful in every aspect of your life is to really raise your awareness. Train yourself to see connections and patterns out there in your interpersonal relationships. Just like we're seeing patterns and connections in all of our parts of our ethical toolbox when we're trying to formulate our idea of what a person of integrity looks like. So Confucius offers here these 9 patterns of awareness, and what he's doing here is moving us from just knowledge, which is knowledge of the facts, our course theory, to a sense of understanding. With experience comes understanding. You take knowledge, you add experience, you get understanding, and then all those over time you can develop wisdom. So he lists those 9 things here, and we've covered some of these already, so I'll let you just review them, kind of focusing on remembering to listen, hear distinctly he's talking about, and I think that's important, and it's also covered in our textbook in those chapters about communicating well, and through caring and balanced personhood. So look those over, because that's what Confucius is giving us to say, look, staying on the right track, practice moderation, keep it in your daily practice. You can use fairness as a general rule, categorical imperative, golden rule sort of things, and really work on your awareness of patterns, commonalities, and connections in life, and how they show up in your interpersonal relationships and your communication with others. I'm going to stop the tape for a moment now, and we're going to switch gears to something on the other outline. We're going to look at Zen and the person of integrity. I'll be right back. Welcome back to sort of part 2 of our discussion here on ethics around the world. To depart from the textbook a little bit, I thought we could talk just briefly about Zen and the person of integrity. Because Zen, again, is not necessarily, we often hear of Zen Buddhism, but you can be a Zen Christian, you can be a Zen Aristotelian, you can be a Zen Kantian, because Zen in itself is not so much related to exact, how am I trying to say this? Let me think for a minute. Exact religious practices, but it's a general way of coming back into your real self, really realizing your true nature. And I think it's important in our study here to add this to our ethical toolbox, because when we're trying to decide, remember, with our intellect what's the right thing to do, be motivated with our spiritedness to do that right thing, and then have the appropriate emotional response, we need to have some sense of our true human personhood. And Zen is actually concerned directly with that very thing. So I think it's valuable to add to our ethical toolbox. And I like what our outline says, what Roshi Ohara says here about Zen. Zen practice is not about getting away from our life as it is. Many people think, oh, you have to meditate for hours and hours a day and remove yourself from life. But no, says Roshi Ohara. Roshi Ohara, she says, it's about getting into our life as it is, with all its vividness, beauty, hardship, joy, and sorrow, and embracing all of those things. And as a person, and certainly even as a professional, in our work life we have really successful times, we have times of struggle, we have times of, we'll see later in this lesson, cultural conflict. And Zen says embrace all those things, because it helps us all to awaken to, if you will, who you really are. And that doing that, realizing that, balancing yourself in that way, will put you in an even better position to serve others as a professional of integrity under the Ono rule. I added a little bit there to Roshi Ohara's comments, just to apply them, of course, to our study here. And what's relevant, at least in Zen here, is I want to mention the Eightfold Path, because, well, you know, I wouldn't want you to go away from this part of the lecture without some sort of list, right? No. But again, you'll see lots of combinations and connections here to both Confucius and Kant and Aristotle and the utilitarians. And again, we'll add these to our toolbox with the hopes of building a sense of what a person with integrity looks like, and then how we can apply those in our lives as professionals. So number one, seeing from your outline, seeing and recognizing the four virtues, which we're actually not going to talk about today, is a vision of purity, and those are known as right views. So you have to take that first step and position yourself with your intellect and your spirit and your emotions to kind of have an openness. It's a calm and open approach to your interactions with others and to your own life. The second step is right determination. Now, all of these are going to be right determination, right views, right actions, right livelihood. And right here, we're not saying like right and wrong. Right here means it's together, it's complete. It's sort of like when Confucius says your actions and your words ought to match. Well, that's the same sort of thing here. So step one on the Eightfold Path is having right views, in other words, and that's kind of what you're bringing of yourself and your calm and open mindedness even. The second step is right determination, and there again we're saying you need to have pure intentions when you're starting on the path. If we want to learn about ethics, if we want to understand another person's views, then we need to start, at least with an open, pure intention, not with a bunch of biases, not with a bunch of prejudices. So that's sort of how we can apply right determination to our ethical toolbox in our practice of being a person with integrity in the world. The third step is right words, and I just think this is a good quote sometime to ponder a little bit, especially when, well, just ponder it. I'm not going to add any more. Better than 1,000 useless words is one word that gives us peace. And we Irish, we Rileys and O'Reillys, we practice what the Irish call síochána, which is trying to find a peacefulness in your nature, trying to find that natural part of you that really is peaceful. And so I'll hold this up. I don't know how this is going to come out. I probably should have something behind it. But it's it looks funny because you know, it doesn't look like you'd say síochána, but that's how it's pronounced actually. And so that's what we Irish folk like to work on, and that's involved in here too, in the third step, right words. In other words, you know, consider what you're saying, and it's better to find a word that brings another peace. It shows that Kantian respect for others, also, than 1,000 just verbiage words. The fourth step is right action. This is good and pure work that we engage in as an offering of love, but also as professionals under that oh no rule. We're trying to meet people's needs in the best way we can, in the most reasonable way we can, to meet their real needs in the world, because we operate with that opportunity we've had to gain extra knowledge and skills and expertise that folks need out in the world. So that's right along with right action. The fifth step is right livelihood. And there you're thinking about using, it says here, the right means to support your life. You're not working for the use of things that are useless or harmful. You'll recall one of our, really the overriding obligation we have to our clients is to do no harm. And this would be what we should think about in our livelihood, how we earn our living and make our way in the world. We should really see, is it being harmful? Is it useful? And does it harm others? If the answer is it does harm to others, we certainly need to think about changing that, as a person of integrity seeks to do no harm. The sixth step is then right effort, again, complete or coherent effort. And that's the proper balance between tension, of working, and relaxation in your life. And approaching everything with that balanced attitude that we've started our entire ethical toolbox with. In other words, we have that balance that the Golden Mean is suggesting, that balance where we have the appropriate emotional response. We don't act out of anger, we don't use harsh words, we don't act out of frustration, but we seek that balance, that harmony between our intellect, our emotions, and our spirit. So that would be right effort. Number 7 then is right remembrance, or what you've often heard of, pardon me, nowadays is mindfulness, and that's remembering your true nature. Remember, that's what Zen is awakening in us, some sense of what our true nature is, that calm peacefulness that the Irish seek. And there's involved in that is some amount of silence and stillness in your life. You don't have to meditate or even prayerfully do so, but that you need some sort of stillness to even make ethical decisions in your life. So that way you're not making them out based on emotion or based on frustration or something, and you're not just giving maybe what we'd call too overly analytical a spin on situations, but that you bring all the faculties of your personhood into play in giving a well-balanced, mindful response. And finally, then the eighth step is called samadhi. And this is sort of the sense of enlightenment that's very popular word today, but it's where they say you reach the end of your journey. And of course, as we pardon me, are developing our ethical toolbox and learning to apply it in the world, the journey's never really over completely. It's always something we can work on a little bit more. And as we live out in the world and in the work world, encounter different ethical situations and dilemmas, of course, the journey's never really complete. Zen also has this sort of sense of a middle path and a balance, and those are on your outline there. The middle way sounds very much like moderation that Confucius talked about. It sounds very much like the golden mean. It sounds very much like the balance we're trying to seek, that so we can make really solid, creative, constructive, successful, ethical choices and decisions in our work life, and certainly in our personal life as well. These carry over. So the middle way is called that middle path. Sounds very familiar, yes? And it's not swerving one way or the other, but remaining level, balanced, and moving through with sort of a deepening understanding, ever more deepening awareness of your true nature, which then can be reflected out into the world as a person of integrity. And that awareness, too, that Confucius was talking about, I guess, behooves us all to, use our brains, our gray matter, our spirit, our emotions to expand our awareness and connection and relation to others in the world, to really all living things. And that not only enhances your own life, but it raises your sense of who you really are, who you be in the world, right? Buddha told his disciples one simple thing: watch the tracks of desire. In other words, watch your emotions and your appetites, like Aristotle warned us against. Be still and know. In other words, still your mind. Don't let all the planning and I got to go to the store and what am I going to make for dinner and oh, how about that laundry and even in the workplace, oh gee, I've got this and this and this and this. He says somewhere in there you have to be still. You have to still that kind of go, do. You have to quiet those emotions. Then you will be able to see with new eyes, said Jesus, right? You'll be able to see and hear differently. And you'll be able to see things how they really are. And if anything, in ethical situations, to see how things really are, to see a large picture, a wide-angle lens. Right now we're kind of on telescoping lens here. To take yourself out of the details a bit, rest your emotions, quiet them, rest and quiet your mind a little bit so that your spiritedness can motivate you and allow you to have that openness to truly see what is going on there in that situation. So that's a little bit on Zen and how that can add to our ethical toolbox, how it connects then to our other philosophers we've studied, our other ethical theory we've studied, and how you can then add that to your sense of what it means to be a person living and leading with integrity. We'll stop the tape here and I'll come back with a few more comments. I'll be right back. The next part of our lecture is, I'm just going to quickly mention that I'd like you to look over the outline on Hinduism, its main themes and some of the characteristics they suggest of a person of peace. Again, we Irish folk like to promote that, so please look that part over. And then as you figure out the additions to your ethical toolbox there, begin to think about and reflect upon how all these, from utilitarianism to Kantianism and respect for others, to what Aristotle had about living virtuously and the golden mean, to what Confucius has offered us about the characteristics of a person with integrity and how to stay on the right track, and as well as Zen and Hinduism here that we have covered separately. Begin to look and think about what are the commonalities, what are the connections I have here. As I said earlier, differences are often much easier to see, but they're not nearly as useful as any common ground or common foundation we have in which to interact with each other. And then we're going to connect all those to our kind of three-pronged approach of determining the right thing to do, mostly with our intellect, having that appropriate emotional response, and then having our spiritedness motivates us to then do the right thing. So we're now starting to draw everything together here in which lesson? Topic 10, I think this is. Now we're drawing everything together. We're saying, what can we take here, put in our ethical toolbox, and then apply in the world? Because we're going to cover 2 more chapters, and all of these things are going to be involved, to be able to be applied. So start to do that now as you look over that last bit of the outline on Hinduism. And I'd like to finish then with a few comments on the cultural conflict decision procedure on page 109, I believe. 109, oops, one page. Yes, 109 in our textbook. It's about, I guess, halfway down the page, and it starts with, still not all conflicts will disappear on closer inspection. And the authors Manning and Stroud give us sort of 4 steps, if you will, in a decision procedure, as they've offered us along the way in the textbook, when we find we're in a situation where we have cultural conflict. So that's where these, what do we have in common to use as a foundation to resolve conflicts like this, is going to come in very, very handy. So let's talk about this a little bit. Number 1, they say, recognize your position to negotiate. You're really not in a position to negotiate with someone who has a different viewpoint than you until you give an honest and fair hearing to what it is and really try to understand where they're coming from. Remember we talked about you can have knowledge of the facts, and then if you have some sort of sense of experience, that's where those common things come into play. Common experience, then you can better understand maybe where the other person, the really basis of their point of view. Once you have that position of understanding, and think about that, those 9 patterns are really going to help that Confucius mentioned. They're very applicable here because you're going to listen distinctly to what the other person is saying, trying to express. Zen is going to come into play because you're going to present an open, calm mind and spirit to really hear what they're saying. And then you can put yourself in a position to relate to what they're saying and their viewpoint, and hence have, if you will, an understanding. Then you can see where you can negotiate. If you won't allow yourself, if you're rather tenacious in your view, or you're holding on to your biases, of course you're not going to be in a position to negotiate because you've already judged whatever they're saying to be unacceptable. So you really need to try your very best to put these things into play, those 9 patterns of awareness from Confucius, that sort of Zen approach, even Aristotle's moderation applies there also. Then you're in a position to say, this is what the other person's saying, I know this is what I'm saying, and now we can actually negotiate or not. It depends. The second step says, decide what is negotiable and what is not. you're not going to just give up all your principles or give up all the obligations we've talked about to clients in order to negotiate. Some things aren't going to be negotiable. And as a person of integrity, working under that oh no rule, you're going to hold on to those important values. And that's again where, if we've looked at what do we have in common, almost all of us want to be treated with respect, right, when there's a conflict or any time. We want to be told the truth. We don't want to be told falsehoods. That's one of the obligations we have to clients. We all want that fairness that both the obligations and Confucius talk about. So those things then are where everybody agrees, and we're not going to negotiate away honesty. We're not going to negotiate away fairness. And so those are the things we would call non-negotiable. So review that ethical toolbox. That's what it's there for when you're deciding what is negotiable and what is not. So you've decided, right, I put myself in a position to in goodwill, negotiate with someone else, really trying to understand what they're saying, their real position. We've determined what's negotiable and what's not value-wise. We've reviewed the ethical toolbox so that we know that ahead of time. And then number 3, we're going to carefully consider what's at stake in the conflict. And San's a good example right now off the top of my head. Basically, you're going to analyze all the alternatives, and then you can compromise when possible. Again, the common ground, it's a broken record, right? That common ground, the places we all agree there, and understanding what the other person is what their position really is without bias and prejudice. That's going to help us then make a list, if you will, of alternatives and see where we overlap, and that's how negotiation can continue. And then finally, you have to establish your position from various options. One is you can compromise, and that's often the case in the workplace, and we'll see that when we move on to chapters 8, and if we get to chapter 10 in our textbook, we'll look at some of those. So you can always compromise. Sometimes we do have to walk away from the conflict or the situation if we really can't compromise, and we're not about to, rightfully so, give up an important value. Then of course you have to walk away from the conflict and say this just isn't negotiable. And the third option is always to say, look, I really think my position is the strongest, the most successful, and then you work to convince others of its value, keeping in mind that you're doing this from a position of respect, of Kantian respect and moderation. You're practicing those 9 patterns of awareness, so that you come to people in your convincing of them with relevant arguments, relevant information, and kindliness and gentleness and balance, that peacefulness again of the Irish, so that they can actually hear what you're saying, and so you're not acting out of an emotion, or you're not acting too aggressively or something like that, but that you assert your position and you present relevant support for it in your attempt to convince others that your position is the best one to go with. So those are sort of the 3 options once you've put yourself in a position to truly understand the other people's positions. You've decided, look, I can compromise on these things, I can negotiate on these things, but I can't on these important values and principles. I've analyzed all the alternatives. I've looked at what is our common ground, where do we overlap, where can we meet, where do we have a meeting of the minds, I think, isn't that what it's called? And then you can say, okay, now, can I compromise? Can we compromise this conflict and resolve it that way? Do I just have to walk away because it's just not possible to compromise or to negotiate it? Or do I really think I've got the solution? And not from a sense of ego, but from that balanced sense that Zen's talking about. Do I really think I have the best position, the best resolution? And then I'll calmly and respectfully present that to the other people in the best way I can. So that wraps up cultural conflict here, and our discussion of now what we've considered to be ethics in the world, some other ethical positions, plenty of good information from Confucius, from the general practice of Zen, and from Hinduism, that we can connect directly to our study in Chapter 3 of the Western perspectives. And so now we can take all those and place them carefully in our ethical toolbox to help guide us in making the most successful ethical decisions we can in the world, and put them into action when we're resolving any sort of conflicts as professionals, living and leading with integrity. Thank you, and I'll see you next time for our lessons on Chapter 8.